Frieza!
He's come out. He's joining the battle.
It all comes down to this. My fate, Planet Vegeta's Kakarot's. And yes, yours too, Frieza. We settle it here! What the? Kakarot. Kakarot! Shields! Shields!
Deuteronomy is a book from the Old Testament and the Torah. It follows Exodus, which tells how Moses freed the Hebrews from their slavery in Egypt, then led them to the Sinai desert in search of the Promised Land, which was followed by a 40-year wandering. In Deuteronomy, we're told why God kept those who are also called the Israelites hanging around for so long until all those who had known pharaonic oppression died out. I swear that none of the men from this evil generation will enter the good land which I promised to give to their ancestors. You said that your children were going to become the spoils of the victors. Well, they who today do not yet know how to distinguish between good and evil, they will enter the land. Even Moses is denied access to said promised land. Look at the land I promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said to them, I will give this land to your descendants. I show it to you, but you will not enter it. In the original Star Trek series, Captain Kirk and his crew always fought to spread and uphold the ideals of the Federation, bringing peace where there was war and acceptance where there was bigotry. As the franchise celebrated its 25th anniversary, Star Trek The Next Generation had aired for 4 seasons on television and prophesied that a day would come when the Federation and the Klingon Empire would bury the hatchet, notably allowing Worf to work on the bridge of the Enterprise D as a Federation officer. But in the films, we were still following the adventures of the Enterprise A, and Kirk's crew was stuck in their own context, that of the original series, which had started during the Cold War, and in which the tensions between the Federation and the Klingon Empire echoed the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, the Cold War was coming to an end. The Berlin Wall had fallen in 1989, and some historians believe that the fall of the Soviet Union can be traced back to the nuclear disaster of Chernobyl, which occurred in 1986.
Mr. Sulu, if I'd wanted a Russian history lesson, I'd have brought along Mr. Chekhov.
While the end of the Cold War seemed to have been predicted by Gene Roddenberry, who had put an end to the tensions between the Federation and the Klingon Empire in Star Trek The Next Generation, it was the opportunity to conclude the cinematic adventures of the original crew by explaining how the Federation and the Klingon Empire finally made peace.
Oh, eventually you will have peace, but only after millions of people have died. It is true that in the future, you and the Klingons will become fast friends. You will work together.
Star Trek VI The Undiscovered Country, directed and co-written by Nicholas Meyer, who can finally use the title he wanted to give to the second film, was released in 1991, 20 days before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Over the course of this series of video essays, I have demonstrated that although Star Trek 2, 3, and 4 form a narrative trilogy, the Star Trek Hexalogy can be divided into 2 thematic trilogies. While the first 3 films are about the rebirth, death, and resurrection of Star Trek to the cinema, the next 3 films are about what Star Trek has to offer us, which is the message that we can and should aspire to a better world, and how we should go about achieving that better world. But the Hexalogy still had one final argument to make, and what could be more dramatic than to present that final argument as Kirk is challenged like he's never been in his entire life. A challenge aimed at his core values and what he's fought for since the very first episode of the original series. A challenge aimed at his desire to improve the world and his ability to accept the consequences. In other words, the time has come to give him the ultimate test. After all he's been through, and especially after what happened to his son, does Kirk live up to the ideals he stood for throughout his career in Starfleet, throughout his life? After facing several threats from the past, such as V'ger, Khan, Klingon traditionalism, the 80s, and God, the crew of the Enterprise now find themselves facing the future, and it's now Kirk and his friends who represent an archaic threat. An historic opportunity arises when Praxis, the moon where the Klingon Empire's most important energy production center is located, explodes due to overmining and insufficient security measures. With only 50 years left before the ozone layer of the Klingon planet completely deteriorates, the Empire no longer has the means to maintain its tensions with the Federation, and Sarek opens a dialogue with Gorkon, the Chancellor of the Klingon High Council, so that he comes to Earth to negotiate peace accords. Without bothering to consult Kirk, Spock proposes that the Enterprise escort Gorkon's ship to Earth before more conservative Klingons convince the Empire to instead attempt to invade Federation space, and the presence of Kirk, who has defeated the Klingons more than once, is relied upon to discourage Klingons opposed to peace from attacking Gorkon. But Kirk, who has never forgiven the Klingons for his son's death, also opposes making peace with them, as does Admiral Cartwright, a character who appeared in the Voyage Home. In a cruel irony, Admiral Cartwright is played by Brock Peters, who played Tom Robinson in To Kill a Mockingbird, and he condemns the Klingons in the same way that Tom Robinson was condemned. When Kirk confronts Spock about the peace with the Klingons and criticizes his initiative for volunteering the Enterprise for this mission, the film makes it clear that these two longtime friends have never been so divided.
How could you vouch for me?
They're animals, Jim. There is an historic opportunity here. Don't believe them. Don't trust them. They are dying. Let them die.
William Shatner disapproved of Kirk being showed a racist, believing that it went against his character. And although I criticized The Last Jedi during my episode on the Wrath of Khan for misrepresenting the character of Luke Skywalker by showing him ready to murder his nephew in his sleep, perhaps this is an opportunity for those who disagree with me to retort by siding with Shatner. Unfortunately for them, I don't consider showing Kirk being racist towards Klingons in the Undiscovered Country to be against the character, because unlike Luke, who not only demonstrated his stubbornness in believing there was still good in Darth Vader and received validation of this belief, Kirk instead received validation of his distrust for the Klingons when they killed David. Although Gene Roddenberry claims, and that's why he hated the script of the Undiscovered Country, that there was no racism in the Federation,
Leave any bigotry in your quarters. There's no room for it on the bridge.
we have to admit that Kirk and McCoy have more than once hurled discriminatory remarks at Spock.
She found humanoid appearance revolting, but she thought she could get used to it.
Oh, she did she? Now tell me, did she happen to make any comment about those ears?
Not specifically, but I did get the distinct impression she found them the most attractive human characteristic of all. I didn't have the heart to tell her that only I have...
She really liked those ears?
Naturally. You could hardly claim to be an angel with those pointed ears, Mr. Spock. But say you landed someplace with a pitchfork.
Is there anyone on this ship who even remotely looks like Satan?
I am not aware of anyone who fits that description, Captain.
No, Mr. Spock. I didn't think you would.
Spock, I know we've had our disagreements. Maybe they're jokes. I don't know. As Jim says, we're not often sure ourselves sometimes. But what I'm trying to say is...
Doctor, I'm seeking a means of escape. Will you please be brief?
I'm trying to thank you, you pointed-eared hobgoblin.
And that Kirk and his crew have always treated Klingons as a morally archaic race.
They want to start the war by pretending that we did.
Chekhov may be right. Klingons claim to have honored the truce, but there have been incidents, raids on our outposts.
No proof that the Klingons committed it.
What proof do we need? We know what a Klingon is.
The Undiscovered Country not only highlights an internal conflict within Kirk that began at the end of the third film, but also a societal issue with the Federation that has been present since the original series, because the animosity experienced by Kirk and his crew towards the Klingons had never been questioned. In fact, hating the Klingons was one of the fundamental ingredients of Star Trek, like hating the Galactic Empire in Star Wars or the Orcs in The Lord of the Rings. But Kirk and McCoy weren't the only persons to be racist towards Spock. In fact, Spock has experienced racism throughout his career. This is why he's well placed to understand what awaits the Klingons who will come to negotiate the peace accords on Earth. and also why he's preparing to leave Starfleet to follow his father's footsteps and devote himself to interplanetary diplomacy. For this purpose, he trained a Vulcan to replace him. The narrative function that Valeris serves in the plot of the Undiscovered Country was initially to be filled by Savick, the Vulcan from the Wrath of Khan and the Search for Spock. But this new character helps to accentuate the contrast between the Kirk from the Wrath of Khan and the one from the Undiscovered Country, highlighting how far he has come since the first film. While he did not accept being contradicted in the motion picture,
All right, explanation. Why was my phaser order countermanded?
and he needed to be defended by Spock in the Wrath of Khan,
May I quote General Order 12? On the approach of any vessel when communications have not been established.
Lieutenant, the Admiral is well aware of the regulations.
he is now able to defend himself without becoming tyrannical.
Captain, may I remind you that regulations specify thrusters only while in space dock?
Jim.
You heard the order, Lieutenant.
Aye, sir.
To play the role of Gorkon, a character serving as a metaphor for Gorbachev, Meyer chooses an actor familiar to him and Star Trek, that is, David Warner. His appearance is inspired by both Abraham Lincoln and Captain Ahab, so that it makes it unclear whether to trust him or not. Gorkon is notably accompanied by his daughter Azadbur and General Chang, played by Christopher Plummer, a Shakespearean actor from Montreal like William Shatner, and rightly chosen by Meyer to recite Shakespeare throughout the film.
Tickle us, do we not laugh? Prick us, do we not bleed? Wrong us, shall we not revenge?
Despite all the contempt he feels for the Klingons, Kirk remains a representative of the Federation, and so invites Gorkon and his entourage to eat with him and his officers aboard the Enterprise. But the Romulan alcohol offered by Valeris to lighten the atmosphere has the opposite effect, and courtesies quickly give way to insults.
To be or not to be? That is the question which preoccupies our people, Captain Kirk. We need breathing room.
Earth, Hitler, 1938.
I beg your pardon?
Well, I see we have a long way to go.
After the departure of Gorkon and his companions, the Enterprise shoots on the bird of prey without Kirk's order, disabling the artificial gravity aboard the Klingon ship. Worse, two individuals break in and attack Gorkon. Reality caught up with fiction when, during the shooting of the film, Gorbachev was kidnapped during a coup in Moscow. Gorbachev survived the coup, but many others were killed for their peaceful speeches, often by the most conservative members of their own community, who never have anything to fear. For now, it's unknown who opened fire on Gorkon, but Kirk and McCoy plead with the Klingons to let them teleport aboard their ship to come to his aid. Despite McCoy's best efforts, Gorkon dies, but not without confining his dream to Kirk.
Don't let it end this way, Captain.
Then the unthinkable happens. Kirk surrenders and lets General Chang arrest him and McCoy. The two friends face a trial in which the Klingons are happy to have finally gotten their hands on their longtime enemy, just as Chang is happy to quote Adlai Stevenson when questioning Soviet representative Valerian Zorin during the missile crisis.
Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no? Don't wait for the translation, yes or no?
Indeed, the record shows that Captain Kirk once held the rank of Admiral, and that Admiral Kirk was broken for taking matters into his own hands in defiance of regulations of the law. Do you deny being demoted for these charges? Don't wait for the translation! Answer me now!
Michael Dorn, the actor who played Worf in The Next Generation, has the opportunity to play Worf's grandfather here, assigned to the defense of Kirk and McCoy. But despite his efforts to exonerate them, the defendants are found guilty of Gorkon's murder after the quite revealing recording of Kirk's captain's log is played.
I've never trusted Klingons. And I never will. I've never been able to forgive them for the death of my boy.
This isn't the first time that Kirk has been put on trial because of a setup against him, but he seems much less confident this time around, and for a good reason. Kirk knows he's guilty, at least in thought. Like an Andy Dufresne imprisoned for a crime he might have ended up committing, Kirk recognizes that he deserves his punishment, and with McCoy, they are condemned to work for the rest of their lives in the mines of Rura Pente, a truly Siberian gulag which bears the name of a prison in Tolstoy's War and Peace. Yes, Meyer likes to imprison Kirk around the middle of the Star Trek films he directs, and to transfer a crew member to another ship, in occurrence, the Excelsior from the third film. But the major difference between the Wrath of Khan and the Undiscovered Country is that in the Wrath of Khan, Kirk was able to defeat his opponent because the latter was blinded by his thirst for revenge, whereas now, it's Kirk who is overcome by his grudge against the Klingons. Kirk has become his own enemy, the ultimate obstacle to everything he has fought for in his life, a metaphor that manifests itself when Marcia, a shapeshifter who offered to help Kirk and McCoy escape so that they can stop the assassination of the Federation's president, betrays them and assumes the appearance of Kirk.
I can't believe I kissed you. Must have been your lifelong ambition.
However, Spock had placed a tracker on Kirk's back before letting him go on Gorkon's ship, and like when they tricked Khan using coded language in the second film, their defeat was only temporary.
Who wanted us killed?
Since you're all going to die anyway, why not tell you? His name is...
No, not... Son of a... Hell of all the... Son of a... Couldn't you have waited 2 seconds, Captain? He was just about to explain the whole thing.
You want to go back?
Absolutely not.
After Kirk's arrest, Spock immediately assumed command of the Enterprise and began an investigation to uncover the identities of Gorkon's murderers, taking the opportunity to quote his ancestor Arthur Conan Doyle, well known to Nicholas Meyer.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible,
whatever remains,
however improbable,
must be
the truth.
What are we looking for, sir?
Lieutenant.
2 pairs of gravity boots.
For his part, Chekhov stayed true to himself.
There's an old saying on Earth, Mr. Sulu. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me.
I know this saying. It was invented in Russia. The Garden of Eden was just outside Moscow. A very nice place. It must have made Adam and Eve very sad to leave.
Where's Apollo?
He disappeared again, like the cat in that Russian story.
Don't you mean the English story, the Cheshire Cat?
Cheshire? No, sir. Minsk, perhaps,
All right.
He took this opportunity to attribute the tale of Cinderella to Russia.
Perhaps you know Russian epic of Cinderella. If shoe fits, wear it.
Mr. Chekhov.
After rescuing Kirk and McCoy, the crew of the Enterprise discovers that the killers were sent by Valeris. To get the names of the other conspirators, Spock performs a forced mind meld on his protege, in other words, a mind rape, which shocks the rest of the crew as well as Spock himself. This scene obviously makes us uncomfortable, especially when we know Spock and we try to imagine how intense his anger must be to push him to commit such a gesture. His icy expression and the horror on his friends' faces is matched only by the pain expressed by Valeris. But unlike when the hero of a dated film makes a move, says a phrase, or exhibits behavior that appears clumsy or toxic to our eyes of today, Spock's mental rape of Valeris is intentionally shocking. And in the same way that some people don't appreciate that Kirk is showed as being racist in this film, they don't appreciate that Spock mentally aggressed Valeris in this way. Because if Spock learns who the conspirators are, what he learns about himself is even more disturbing. While the anti-racist Kirk has shown himself to be presumptuous towards the Klingons, Spock, who believed himself above all presumption because of his experience, is also revealed to be guilty of having assumed that those close to him necessarily shared his point of view, and discovers that he is willing to violate a person's mind to fix his mistakes.
Is it possible that we two, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible that we have outlived our usefulness? Would that constitute a joke?
Don't crucify yourself. It wasn't your fault.
I was responsible.
For no actions but your own.
That is not what you said at your trial.
That was as captain of the ship. Human beings.
But, Captain, we both know that I am not human.
Spock, you want to know something? Everybody's human.
I find that remark insulting.
The Undiscovered Country not only concludes the cinematic adventures of the original Star Trek crew, but demonstrates why it's time for them to pass the torch to the next generation. And it's arguably the finest testament to Gene Roddenberry's optimism to show that progress inevitably catches up with and overtakes even the most fervent adherents of progress. Although the Undiscovered Country blamed this phenomenon on age, it's not necessarily age that must be blamed when some people seem archaic, but their experience. Despite their good intentions, Kirk and his friends felt a certain mental block towards the Klingons whom they had so long perceived as enemies devoid of compassion. But at the end of the Undiscovered Country, they set aside this blockage to allow the next generation to be freed from the burden that afflicts theirs and to offer them an even better world than the one they have themselves received from the previous generations. And that they did all this when they themselves are not yet ready to accept the consequences is even more honorable.
Your father called the future the undiscovered country. People can be very frightened of change.
You've restored my father's faith.
And you've restored my son's.
Like Bernie Sanders, who campaigned for equality long before it became as urgent as it is today, it would seem that Gorkon was in favor of peace long before it became a necessity for his people.
You don't trust me, do you? I don't blame you. If there is to be a brave new world, our generation is going to have the hardest time living in it.
We can also interpret the end of the fifth film as a historical precedent allowing us to envisage peace during the sixth film, and thus to find a narrative justification for the final frontier, which we had only been able to defend on the thematic level in the previous video. And while making peace just because you can't afford to go to war may not be the best motivation, Gorkon saw it as an opportunity to realize his dream and bring the Klingons to be able, one day, to enjoy this peace not as a way to survive, but as a way to live better. And that's what happens to Kirk over the course of the film. In the beginning, he fulfills his mission even if he disapproves of it, but in the end, he's motivated to fulfill his mission.
First we change the behavior, then we work on motivation.
This is what Star Trek offers us through the sixth film. In the words of Lincoln Jarrity, the story not only reflected the then current political climate of America at the end of the Cold War, it also spoke of an ideology of faith in the ongoing efforts to maintain peace and bring an end to ideological conflict. Ultimately, it suggested that the motive behind the eventual peace between the two superpowers was an ongoing mission toward a metaphorical promised land, an undiscovered country, which would require the ability to not only accept change, but also live with it. Star Trek is arguably one of the best-known, most inspiring, and most influential utopias in our history. Yet, it must be regularly updated to catch up with our own progress and reality. I am aware that this discourse runs counter to trendy cynicism, and that many of us are convinced that trying to change the world is naive. But we'll never succeed in doing what must be done if we stubbornly believe that nothing can be done about anything, if we stubbornly believe that a Star Trek-like future is impossible, and that it's better to snuggle up in the false comfort of our nostalgia for one of the worst decades in our recent history. As our world gets closer every day to the future predicted by Star Trek, and Star Trek has to adapt each day to the progress we are making, nothing could be more naive than thinking that things were better before. It's time for us to remember that it's possible to improve the world and to stop associating optimism with denial. Being optimistic does not mean that we are convinced that everything is going well when everything is going well. Nor does it mean that we are convinced that everything is going well when everything is going wrong. Being optimistic means that we roll up our sleeves and fight every day to improve the world, even and especially when everything seems to be going wrong, even and especially when we know that our future still has some bad surprises for us, even and especially when we know that fascism is looming on the horizon.
So this is what becomes of us. Eric was right. Humanity does this to us.
Not if we show them a better path.
You still believe?
Just because someone stumbles, loses their way, it doesn't mean they're lost forever. Sometimes we all need a little help.
Oh, I'm not the man I was. I open my mind, and it almost overwhelms me.
You're afraid, and Cerebro knows it.
All those voices. So much pain.
It's not their pain you're afraid of. It's yours, Charles. And as frightening as it may be,
That pain will make you stronger. If you allow yourself to feel it, embrace it, it will make you more powerful than you ever imagined. It's the greatest gift we have, to bear their pain without breaking. And it's born from the most human power. Hope. Please, Charles, we need you to hope again.
I'm not going to abandon the things that make me who I am because of the future. It contains an ending I hadn't foreseen for myself.
This is why I disagree with those who claim that Star Trek Discovery is not an optimistic series. In fact, these people have a funny idea of what optimism is. While Star Trek predicted World War III in the 90s, it didn't happen. Important positions within the Federation became increasingly accessible to people from all kinds of minorities and marginalized groups, and each new series tackles subjects that one would never have thought could be tackled at the time of the original series. Because even Gene Roddenberry, despite his good intentions, did not achieve the ideal he proposed to humanity, but what he bequeathed to us is a way to get there. And even if the reason why the studios promote more diversity and woke morals is to make more money and avoid bad critics, who cares? Like Kirk and like the Klingons, they will end up doing the right thing not because it brings them more money or save them from bad critics, but because they want to. Whereas the previous films had profoundly transformed the Klingons to portray them as bestial and barbaric brutes, the Undiscovered Country humanizes them and instead shows them as being quite cultured, to such an extent that ones end up wondering if the first 5 films weren't told by an unreliable narrator who painted a dark portrait of Klingons because of his biases. And in a way, that's the case. As I pointed out earlier, Star Trek was not immune to racism when it came to Klingons, and the 6th film is where Star Trek breaks free from this negative portrayal of them. We see them as they really are for the first time, and whereas in the series and even more so in the films, they only serve to provide the plot with faceless enemies, such as stormtroopers or orcs, what the Undiscovered Country tells us is that faceless enemies don't exist. Not the saga ending we've been used to, isn't it? It's a shame that in so many works of fiction, war is the only solution, even for the heroes, on the pretext that it's more exciting. In my opinion, trying to make peace in a war-torn world is just as much exciting, if not more so.
You don't understand a thing, do you, Admiral? This isn't a blockade. This is language, a new vocabulary, the likes of which the world has never seen. This is President Kennedy communicating with Secretary Khrushchev.
Besides, through their traditionalism, so often criticized by Gene Roddenberry in the original series, the Klingons will provide the next generation screenwriters the opportunity to critique the Federation's imperialism and its Western-centric view of modernity, while new opponents will offer a cautionary tale against it, as V'ger once did. Star Trek can continue to evolve because we evolve too, even beyond that Roddenberry had dreamed for the future. Now the Enterprise no longer goes where no man has gone before, but where no one has gone before.
This is the final cruise of the Starship Enterprise under my command. This ship and her history will shortly become the care of another crew. To them and their posterity will we commit our future. They will continue the voyages we have begun and journey to all the undiscovered countries, boldly going where no man, where no one has gone before.
For their part, Kirk and his crew may feel they have outlived their usefulness and that they have lost their right to access the Promised Land, but rather than die in the desert like Moses and the overaged Israelites, the desert that made them cowboys exploring the new frontier, they decide to remain young and heroic forever, in Neverland and in our memory.
Course heading, Captain.
Second star to the right. And straight on till morning.
The Enterprise takes on the direction of a star like the cowboy riding away into the setting sun at the end of westerns of yesteryear, and the circle is complete for the crew of the original series. A series by which Gene Roddenberry, inspired by the speech of John F. Kennedy, had transposed wagon trains into space. Roddenberry was able to see the Undiscovered Country a few days before his death, and although he still disapproved of certain elements from the script, such as the military aspect of Starfleet, it is said that he enjoyed the film. This concludes this series of video essays about the original Star Trek Hexalogy. If you're wondering why I kept making parallels between Star Trek and Dragon Ball during this series, here comes the moment you were waiting for. While I was starting to edit my videos, YouTuber Maggie Mae Fish, whom I adore, published the second part of a video about Joseph Campbell. I learned many things that disappointed me, since he was the first writer through which I learned to make connections between the stories I liked. And as you've probably noticed, I love to make connections. But I don't believe that we can explain all the similarities between stories by Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Instead, I believe that stories obey an internal logic even bigger than their writers. While I had for objective to prove that the Star Trek Hexalogy forms a coherent whole, even if it wasn't planned and that the films hadn't been written by the same person, I showed that we could find similarities with another work of fiction which wasn't planned either and which came from the other side of the world, from the imagination of a writer neither Christian or Jewish. I also showed that we can make parallels between Star Trek and myths that predate Christianity. While it's trendy online to accuse Harry Potter of being a copy of Star Wars, and we can accuse Harry Potter of many things, to pretend that the tropes found in Harry Potter were invented by Star Wars show that we don't really know what we're talking about. This is why I think that YouTube channels about film analysis are so important. There is a lot of passionate people out there, but so few experts, which is quite normal. I hope you enjoyed the few things I could share with you, no matter if you were Trekkies or not, and I hope to see you again soon for another series of video essays.